Hello, listeners and fellow explorers. This is Living in the Sprawl's lovely and talented producer/fiancée, Lisa Lowe. I wanted to thank all of you for your constant support of the show. As a new podcast on the scene, the number one way to support the show is to rate, review, and share this podcast with everyone you know. Many of you have been doing this, and it has helped immensely. You can also check out our website and the show notes for other ways to support the show. We have new merch on our website, and we are working with companies that we currently use ourselves to get discount codes for our listeners and support the research and work we do for the show in the process. These companies include Every Table Meal Delivery Service, which offers delicious, cost-effective meals delivered straight to your door. Just CBD Store, which offers great tasting CBD-only gummies in a variety of flavors, and Miss to Mrs. boxes for brides-to-be. My sister Jennifer surprised me with this box when I got engaged, and it was the most perfect, thoughtful gift. You can also support us on Patreon and Podfan. Please check out the website at livinginthesprawlpodcast.com for updates on companies we are working with, our testimonies, links, codes, and new Living in the Sprawl merchandise. Again, thank you to all of you, our lovely listeners, for tuning in every week and allowing us to do what we love. Without further ado, your humble correspondent, Jon Steinberg.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of Living in the Sprawl, Southern California's most adventurous podcast. I am your humble correspondent and host. My name is Jon Steinberg. Sitting alongside me, as always, is my lovely and talented producer/fiancée. Her name is Lisa Lowe. She is running the boards and manning operations for our collective outfit. On today's episode, we do a little bit of digging in our own backyard. As has been mentioned a couple of times on various episodes over the course of the show's lifespan, Lisa and I reside in the San Fernando Valley. I am, of course, not from the area. She is, and has a decidedly different relationship with Los Angeles' backyard than I do. Before I moved with her to Encino, I basically knew that the valley was where adult films had been made and some relatively seedy activity had taken place. So I thought this would be as good of a reason as any to document and compile a list detailing some of those sordid events that I had learned about as a younger person and had on my mind before actually moving to the area. Now, the San Fernando Valley is a weird place, just plain and simple. It's over the hill from Los Angeles proper, and as I have learned, that's actually what you say when you venture to Hollywood, Santa Monica, Westwood, any of the communities that are over the proverbial set of hills. But what goes on in the backyard, that is the subject of today's show. So, what better way to kick off a comprehensive examination of the valley's most lurid, salacious anecdotes than to detail a story that, of course, takes place within the realm of the adult film industry. Let's get to it. At number 10, the 2010 murder of adult film star, you can't see it, but I'm doing air quotation marks and using the word star, but the June 2010 murder of adult film performer Herbert Wong, who went under the alias Tom Dong in his acting work. He was killed by his best friend, a gentleman named Stephen Clancy Hill, whose screen name was Steve Driver. So this happened in the Van Nuys section of the valley, which is arguably the seediest place in the entire San Fernando region, and where an inordinate amount of movies in the pornography industry have been shot, companies have been based, and crimes have taken place as a result. My fiance and I, we like to call sections of Van Nuys the red light district of the valley. So this murder happened within the bounds of the red light district. So Stephen Clancy Hill, Steve Driver, and Herbert Wong, Tom Dong, were referred to as the Chris Tucker and Jackie Chan of the industry, but they were not stars like the main performers in Rush Hour. They were low-level pornography performers who were seen as mopes. Mopes, sort of, I guess, an industry term. I only learned it during the research for this episode, but I guess an industry term for, low-level, fringe-level players who participate in certain kinds of scenes for certain kinds of companies, but are not the ones that you would necessarily see gracing the cover of DVD boxes. In any event, Driver and Dong, while they had a gimmick, they were unable to ascend into the upper echelon of the industry. Now, they didn't really have backup plans. So Hill, Driver, was actually living at Ultima Video in Van Nuys. They were letting him crash there in lieu of a nice paycheck for his on-screen work. And on-screen partners had complained about his smell, some of his personal hygiene, and things were not going the way that he had envisioned them going. So after being told that he was getting set for eviction, things all kind of came crashing down. And on June 1st, 2010, Stephen Clancy Hill stabbed Herbert Wong with a samurai sword that was on hand for use in a film as a prop. But Hill had actually done some aftermarket work on the sword so that the result was fatal for his best friend. He stabbed a couple of other folks and then fled the scene. 4 days later, he was tracked down by authorities and wound up jumping off of a massive cliff in the Chatsworth region. This lurid tale was chronicled in a movie I didn't know about until last night called Mope. This is not a good film. Sorry, not to, kind of punch down, but I have to be honest, it was not a great film. And it played the whole story for laughs, which I thought was kind of a strange move. But it does exist, so if you are interested in seeing a kind of hammy, hackneyed depiction of the events that I just told you about, check out Mope in some form. But I thought it fitting for us to begin our survey of crimes in the San Fernando Valley with something from the adult industry, and that's why Murder of Herbert Wong by Stephen Clancy Hill in June of 2010 begins our list here at number 10. At number 9, we head to the quiet community of Arleta for the 1985 murder of 17-year-old high school student Michelle Avila. So, in the year of our Lord, 1985, high school juniors Michelle Avila, Laura Doyle, and Karen Severson were the best of friends until they weren't, because that's always how it seems to go in high school. Rumors began to circulate on campus, this is San Fernando High School we're talking about here, that Michelle was messing around with Karen's boyfriend, with Laura's boyfriend. Michelle was maybe a bit on the more attractive side and had a bit more going for her than her friends did. And so jealousy came into the picture as her friends, believing that their boyfriends were two-timing them with their supposed best friend, gathered a terrible plot in their minds. In October of 85, Karen and Laura picked up Michelle, who they called Missy, from her home in Arleta and drove her out to the Angeles National Forest. And it was there that her former best friends proceeded to drown her and cover her body with a log that weighed approximately 100 pounds. In the aftermath of the shocking murder, Karen Severson, and this is what I thought really put this heinous act over the top, but Karen, the person who had just taken the life of Michelle Avila, decided to cozy up to her grieving mother, Michelle's mother, Irene. So much so that she even volunteered to move in to the Avila home and take up residence in her best friend / murder victim's former bedroom. But this didn't last very long. Leads that authorities were tracking, because obviously no one would ever think that it was two 17-year-old high school girls who horrifically murdered their friend like this. They'd imagine, oh, it's probably some awful drifter coming through town, or who knows, a serial killer, something like that, but certainly not to 17-year-old high school girls. So the case went cold until some years later, contrition reared its head, and a third girl called authorities, telling them that though she hadn't been a participant, she had been there on the night in 1985 when Michelle Avila was killed. And she said that it was her two high school friends. So ultimately, Karen Severson and Laura Doyle were arrested, charged, and subsequently convicted of the 1985 slaying, accruing prison sentences of 25 years, which both of those women are now out of prison. They served, let's see, the trial began in 1990. Okay, they served 20 years in prison. But for the cold-blooded murder of anyone, but of somebody that was completely innocent, 25 years doesn't seem like enough. It seems like about 40 should be where the bar needs to be met. And Arleta, where parts of the crime took place, and it's as Irene Avila would say, and as is oftentimes the case, it is said, this is not the type of place where that could happen. And that's also part of the reason why I wanted to do this episode, to reinforce the idea that though whenever an awful event takes place, townspeople, folks who reside in the community where the crime happened, they all say, we imagine something like that. That could have never happened here. But that type of thing could happen anywhere. And there's no better example of that than the layout of the San Fernando Valley and all its disparate, odd, singular little communities. So at number 9, the 1985 slaying of Michelle Avila. Oh, before we move on, I have to say this. The producer of this podcast and I watched a feature film the other night. Well, I say feature. It was a made-for-TV production called A Killer Among Friends, retelling the story that I just encapsulated. Tiffany Amber Thiessen stars as Missy Avila, and Patty Duke plays her mother. You can rent the film on Amazon, but how about you just take my word for it? It's not very good, and you are better off reading Karen Kingsbury's 1991 New York Times bestseller, Missy's Murder, that I also listen to, audiobooks, and does a really nifty job of explaining everything that happened and painting the right picture of the Arleta area and time when the event occurred. So, number 9, the murder of Michelle Missy Avila in Arleta. At number 8, we have to throw in an entertainment-related crime. So we turn our focus to the murder of Bonnie Lee Backley, the second wife of Robert Blake, in the Toluca Lake area in 2001. So this is a crime which I don't think I have to go into great detail about because it was covered in extreme detail in all forms of media. Bonnie Lee Backley was murdered while sitting in her car waiting for her husband, Robert Blake, to grab something that he'd forgotten while the two were dining at Vitello's restaurant on Tahunga Avenue in Toluca Lake. As those of you who followed the crime or remember scant details about it might recall, Blake was charged with the murder, acquitted, but then found liable in civil court and ordered to pay an enormous amount of money to Bonnie Lee Backley's family. You might also recall that Bonnie Lee Backley had been married 10 times and was known as something of a grifter, a confidence woman, or a con woman. And if you look, there's a really wild phone conversation on the internet you can hear between Robert Blake and Bonnie Lee Backley when she reveals to him that she's expecting his child. And he says something to the effect of, "You're a stinking no good liar." Something like that. It's really odd, old-timey, and sounds like it had taken place during like 1924, not 2000. But in any event, the place where this crime happened is, again, nowhere near being known as a bastion of crime. Toluca Lake is, pound for pound, the sleepiest of the sleepy communities in not only the valley, but the whole of Los Angeles. It's, where Leonardo DiCaprio's character in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood jokes about being forced to reside because he doesn't think he's going to be able to afford his Benedict Canyon mansion any longer. Vitello's, I've been there. It's what you might term an old school red sauce Italian establishment. And Robert Blake was a frequent guest of the eatery. And if you are so interested, you have the ability to sample the chicken parm from Vitello's if you like, because it still exists. And I also would advise anyone more interested in the case to hop on YouTube and dial up an interview from 2011 that Robert Blake did with Piers Morgan. In the interview, Robert Blake is wearing a sleeveless... He looks like a cowboy who's like far, far away from a cattle drive. It's a sleeveless, like leather vest with no undershirt, and then a pretty bizarre cowboy hat while he's sitting in a studio in either Manhattan or Los Angeles. And Piers Morgan goes after him a little bit. Robert Blake doesn't handle it particularly well. It is a must-see if you've never checked it out before. So, for our first dalliance with the quote-unquote Hollywood community, even though the Valley is decidedly not Hollywood, the crime of Bonnie Lee Backley's murder in 2001. Number 7, the murder of Jack Whalen inside Rondelli's restaurant on Ventura Boulevard in Sherman Oaks in the year of our Lord, 1959. So I wanted to find a crime that had ties to Mickey Cohen or some of the other organized crime figures that populated Los Angeles in the 40s, 50s, 30s, 60s. And I remembered reading a great Los Angeles Times article about this. So here's the crime. In 1959, Mickey Cohen was riding high, the undisputed organized crime king of Los Angeles. So much so that on the night of December 2nd in 1959, he brought his dog inside what sounds like a really nice restaurant to have dinner with a few acquaintances. The dinner was at Rondelli's. It was about 9:30 at night, and his acquaintances were Sammy Losigno and a couple other assorted characters. But for our purposes, we'll focus on Sammy. While the party was really getting going, into the dining hall strode a man known in certain circles as the Enforcer, Jack O'Hara, but his birth certificate would say Jack Whalen. He was there to settle a score. You see, a bookmaker in Woodland Hills was being stiffed by Sammy and his buddy. So the bookmaker turned to freelance mercenary Jack the Enforcer O'Hara, Jack Whalen, as he sought payment as Sam Losigno had done a bit of losing at the horse track. So Jack comes in to Rondelli's and he says hello to Mickey Cohen. And before anyone really knows what happened, he is lying dead on the ground, having been shot in the end by good old Sammy. Mickey Cohen was, of course, questioned by authorities, and he actually told them, I couldn't believe this, but I checked a couple sources. He told them that in really intense, kind of stressful moments where he thought something might happen, he would just go underneath the table. So he would adopt the duck and cover strategy, I guess, during moments of conflict, which sounds very antithetical for the presider of an organized crime outfit, but we will leave that aside for the moment. It was Sam Losigno who had shot Jack as Whalen had demanded enumeration for the poor day at the track. Sam got a bit scared, pulled out a .38, and shot the Enforcer 3 times, killing him right there at an upscale Italian restaurant on Ventura Boulevard. Now, what's interesting is that the space is still a restaurant, and Living in the Sprawl's producer and I had the good fortune of having a meal with her family there not all that long ago. So if you're interested, Wood and Water, they are taking reservations, and it is a lovely establishment. And it was at what is now Wood and Water, what was then Rondelli's, where Jack the Enforcer Whalen was shot to death. Right between the eyes, as they say. The event was partially depicted in the 2013 real letdown of a movie, at least for your humble correspondent, Gangster Squad, where Sean Penn portrayed Mickey Cohen and Ryan Gosling portrayed Detective Jerry Wooters, who in real life was in consultation, shall we say, with Jack Whalen. But on the night in question, in 1959, Jerry Wooters was sort of doing a graveyard shift manning the local prison in Lincoln Heights. So he was not available to watch out for Jack Whalen. And this is what we see in Gangster Squad. So Jack Whalen does appear as a character. he is gunned down. Jerry Wooters, as played by Ryan Gosling, is stuck kind of manning a hybrid between a drunk tank and an enclosed version of The Purge while the murder happens. So, to remind us that it is just over the hill from the Sunset Strip and Beverly Hills and all the places where the dapper gent Mickey Cohen once held court, we examined the 1959 murder of Jack Whalen at Rondelli's restaurant on Ventura Boulevard in Sherman Oaks, which is now Wood and Water. At number 6, the murder of Dorca Lisker on March 10th, 1983, of which her son, Bruce Lisker, was convicted, sentenced, and served multiple decades of prison before being released in 2009 because he didn't do it. So this crime came on my radar when we actually got Paramount Plus, and I noticed a show called Interrogation on the platform. Turned out that the inspiration for the Paramount Plus original was based on the murder of Dorca Lisker and her son's wrongful imprisonment as a result of the crime. The miniseries, Interrogation, this, unlike some of the other depictions referenced in this episode, is actually worth your time. The performances are quite outstanding, and it does a really nice job in portraying how something like this could have happened and why it took so long for this abject wrong to be righted within the court system. So, what happened? Okay, in 1983, again, we find ourselves in Sherman Oaks, not all that far away from where the Jack Whalen murder happened, actually, when 66-year-old Dorca Lisker was found murdered inside her home. The details of the crime are quite brutal. I don't recommend looking them up. But the police really seemed to only have eyes for a single suspect, her 17-year-old son, Bruce, who had been adopted by relatively older parents. I believe Dorca was 49 when her and her husband Bob made the decision to adopt. And it wasn't exactly easy raising Bruce. He had difficulty at school, battled substance abuse problems, and his parents didn't exactly know what to do with him when he just was not performing in school or living up to their expectations. They helped to get him an apartment, believing that it would help him ultimately straighten out. It didn't. He found himself getting in deeper with a not-so-wonderful crowd, deeper with substance abuse, and he actually introduced his parents, or probably more accurately, brought some of these unsavory characters over to his parents' home. But given his own backstory and lack of a credible backstory, that authorities zeroed in on Bruce. He was tried and convicted of second-degree murder and expelled to the system. All the while, he was working on figuring out who actually had committed the crime. And his focus centered on one of the characters that he had brought around the house during his drug-taking days. A fellow by the name of Mike Ryan was the person Bruce believed had committed the murder. Mike was completely destitute, had recently had a falling out with Bruce, and was aware of cash that Dorca and her husband would have on hand. We'll never completely know the truth, as Mike Ryan took his own life in 1996, but in the 2000s, Bruce enlisted some outside help. The folks who took up his cause were able to identify enough evidence and make a compelling enough argument to make it abundantly clear that Bruce had not committed the crime. 26 years had passed between the day his mother was murdered and the day that Bruce Lisker was released from prison for the crime. Now, it's widely speculated and believed by your humble correspondent that it was Mike Ryan who committed the crime, and Bruce was awarded $7.7 million in compensation for the 26 years he had stripped away from his life while being incarcerated. He is now married and thriving, from what I was able to ascertain, as an inspirational speaker and motivational personality. So if you would like to know more about this case, I think watching Interrogation is a pretty good place to start. Again, the performances are outstanding, and the clarity offered by the storytellers really leaves little to the imagination. So, a different kind of crime, but same strange, obtuse backdrop. The murder of Dorca Lisker and her son Bruce's wrongful imprisonment over it. At number 5, we venture back to the red light district, although a nicer subsection of the red light district, Van Nuys, where in 1986, February 24th of 1986, the murder of Sherry Rasmussen took place, and the eventual trial and conviction of her murderer, Stephanie Lazarus. This is a crime that has been covered in a number of different outlets. The Case File True Crime podcast did an excellent episode about it. Hollywood Crime Scene did a really nice one as well. But just to offer kind of the basics of the story, Sherry Rasmussen had recently married a gentleman named John Rutan, and the couple had settled into a life as a couple in the Van Nuys area. But John Rutan had an ex-girlfriend, Stephanie Lazarus, who still carried a torch for her ex-beau. Rutan and Lazarus had dated while both studying at UCLA, and had even hooked up during a moment of weakness for John while he was actually engaged to Sherry. Sherry and Stephanie once had a run-in, and she was fully aware of Stephanie's resentment towards her and unrelenting feelings for her ex-lover. But as was the case with the Missy Avila murder, Los Angeles at this time is still reeling from stuff like the Tate LaBianca murders, the Hillside Strangler murders, the Toolbox murder. I mean, the list goes on and on and on, to be honest. California in the 1970s, just a lot of things transpired in the Golden State during a roughly 15-year time period from like 69 through 74 or so. So the idea of a woman murdering a seemingly innocent lady because she was jealous of her, that type of thing wasn't on the tip of everyone's tongue. So even though Sherry's father raised the possibility of Stephanie's involvement with his daughter's murder, authorities failed to see it that way, and the case went cold. And Stephanie Lazarus became an LAPD police officer, serving multiple decades in that capacity. Now let's flash forward to 2009. So now we are 23 years after the murder. No one's ever been tried for the crime. And again, the case has gone absolutely cold. But crime as a whole has gone down in the city of Los Angeles. It has subsided to the level where detectives see this sort of lull in activity as an opportunity to dig up some cold cases that had never been solved. With the advent of DNA-inspired policing, they believed they might actually solve some old crimes. And one of the ones they were looking into was the unsolved murder of Sherry Rasmussen. They saw that Stephanie Lazarus was mentioned in the case file because she had been the widower's ex-lover, and she was one of roughly 10 people that the detectives took a look at. And through DNA, they realized they had a murderer within their midst. So, if you're interested, you have the ability to look up the police interrogation of Stephanie Lazarus, where they bring her in under the auspices of, we want to work with you on a certain crime and yada yada, only for the conversation to quickly veer into the territory of a police interrogation where it was clear she was the suspect in a crime. So because there was a DNA match, Stephanie was tried and convicted of Sherry's murder, and she is currently serving a long sentence at the Women's Correctional Facility in the city of Corona. And I would really urge folks who would like to know more about the crime to log on to that aforementioned website, YouTube, and search for the interrogation video with Stephanie. It is almost better than anything you'll find on scripted television. She comes in and it just gets going from there. So, a little bit of a different crime. The murder of Sherry Rasmussen, which belatedly, we now know, was committed by Stephanie Lazarus. All right, number 4, wanted to figure out a way to get spirituality into the conversation here. More specifically, spiritual leaders, some would call the groups of individuals over whom they would preside cults. We won't use that term here. We'll say spiritual communities. So the one for this episode that took place in our beloved, odd as the day is long, San Fernando Valley, the 1958 suicide bombing, which took the life of Krishna Venta in the neighborhood of Chatsworth. So Krishna Venta, which is obviously not his birth name, was an individual who told his followers that he was basically the second coming and that there was an impending global catastrophe where everyone on Earth would be divided into different categories. Those who believed in him being Krishna Venta, and those who didn't. Those that did would recognize that a race war was underway, and then a whole bunch of other ridiculous postulations as the planet found itself under a new world order. Additionally, his devotees were asked to remove their shoes, their socks, grow their hair long, and if you were a woman, you would probably be asked to sleep with Krishna Venta. This group, which was known as Fountain of the World, resided in the Box Canyon area, which is a little bit outside of Chatsworth. But for the sake of this discussion, we will say that it's Chatsworth, which you will infamously remember as the location of Spawn Ranch, where Charles Manson and his followers launched their murderous onslaught on the Los Angeles community from. That's good old Chatsworth. So Krishna Venta had a couple of hundred followers, devotees, who believed him to be their spiritual link to a higher being, and enough of them had the financial resources to keep the group afloat and help them purchase a large compound, again, in Chatsworth. After a while, some outsiders took notice of the group, that they weren't wearing any shoes, everybody had long hair, and people were all calling Krishna Venta Master. And enough questions were raised so that some devotees began defecting from his flock. And a couple of these former members heard stories about their wives having relations with the master. They, of course, were none too pleased about this. And in 1958, the community had been around for about 10 years at this point. Two particularly aggrieved former devotees came to the compound for a meeting with the master. But they didn't come empty-handed. With them, they brought 20 sticks of dynamite. And before the master could convince them otherwise, the two former Fountain members detonated the dynamite and killed not only themselves, but also 7 other people who were in close proximity to the compound. This case is covered on an interesting episode of the podcast Cults, if you'd like to know a bit more. And there's no evidence to suggest that Charles Manson ever actually met any of the Fountain members. But by virtue of the fact that his flock resided in Chatsworth as well, and his whole helter-skelter battle plan resembled a lot of things which were outlined by Krishna Venta, the groups seemed like spiritual cousins. So, as a way to remind folks of the Los Angeles region's long, strange relationship with spiritual teachers and some of the more unseemly events that emanated from those relationships, we had to put on our list number 4, the 1958 suicide bombing, which took the life of Krishna Venta in Chatsworth. And number 3, the slaying of silent movie star Ramon Navarro in the Laurel Canyon section of the valley in 1968. So Ramon Navarro is most widely recognized for his performance as Judah Ben-Hur in the first silent version of the classic Ben-Hur. This came out multiple decades before the Charlton Heston version that is on the AFI's list of 100 greatest movies. And his performance in the silent version of Ben-Hur catapulted Mexican Ramon Navarro into superstardom. He starred alongside greats of the era like Greta Garbo and a multitude of others, sort of carrying the matinee idol torch from the deceased Rudolph Valentino in the 1920s and 30s of the entertainment industry. But Navarro had difficulty adapting to the changes ushered in with the advent of talking pictures. He didn't do all that well with talkies because Ramon Navarro possessed a voice that was not all that pleasant to listen to. when characters began actually talking rather than pantomiming, things got tough for Ramon Navarro. Luckily, he'd already purchased a Lloyd Wright, the son of Frank Lloyd Wright, designed home with the money that he'd made from his illustrious silent movie career. And though he had real trouble getting acting work, he'd made a bunch of money already. So with his great fortune, Ramon Navarro proceeded to live a quiet life in the Laurel Canyon area. Now, as a sidebar, some would consider where this crime took place, where the Lloyd Wright house still stands, in which Ramon Navarro resided, to be still Hollywood. For the sake of this episode, I'm calling Laurel Canyon the Valley. You could make a really compelling argument for it being the Valley or Hollywood, and I would, to be honest with you, just like to claim it as a part of the Valley. So for purposes of what we're doing here, Laurel Canyon is the Valley. Ramon Navarro, while being a latter-day sex symbol for millions of female fans all across the world, hid a secret. He was a gay man leading a double life. So while his fleet of fans across the world put his poster on their walls and pined for his affections, Ramon Navarro found love with members of the same sex. He hid his sexual identity from the public and dated intermittently while he resided in the Lloyd Wright house on Laurel Canyon Boulevard. In 1968, he got a phone call from a pair of brothers who heard a rumor that he enjoyed company of the same sex and that he was willing to pay for it. These brothers, both named Ferguson, went to the Laurel Canyon home imagining they'd probably only rob the former silent movie star. In the end, the Ferguson brothers took the life of Ramon Navarro, and I'm not going to talk about them on the podcast, but if you are interested, details of the crime are readily available online, and they are as hideous as anything I've come across. So the two brothers were tried and convicted of the murder, although their sentences were alarmingly light. After being paroled, both brothers would return to prison at different points over the course of their lives, and ultimately they both admitted to what they had done to the star of the silent version of Ben-Hur. There's a really interesting Peggy Lee song called Tango that concerns Ramon Navarro's murder. As weird as you would expect from Miss Lee, the tune is one that you may find difficult to get out of your head after you hear it for the first time. While others would dispute the premise that this is even a valley-based crime, they would tell you it's in the Hollywood Hills. I'm telling you, don't listen to them. This is a crime that took place in the Laurel Canyon area, which is part of the San Fernando Valley, and the third most salacious crime that we're going to cover on Living on the Sprawl. Number 2, the murder of comedian Phil Hartman. This happened in 1998, May 28th of that year, in the neighborhood where the podcast is being recorded. On the 28th of May, 1998, Bryn Hartman, the wife of iconic Saturday Night Live performer Phil Hartman, shot her husband 3 times while he slept in bed. And some hours later, with authorities outside the home, she barricaded herself inside the bedroom and shot herself as well. There's a wonderful biography that came out roughly 3 years ago called You Might Remember Me. that does a terrific job of going through Phil Hartman's rise. He went to Westchester High School. Well, he's originally from Canada, but then when his parents came to the States, they settled in the Westchester area. He went to Westchester. This is in Los Angeles. And he began doing cover art for musical groups like America. He went to CSUN, Cal State Northridge, and when he amassed enough money and a family, bought a lovely family home in the Encino area of the Valley, where the crime would ultimately take place. You may remember Hartman for, as I mentioned, his work on Saturday Night Live, and also his contributions to The Simpsons. He was Troy McClure and a number of other readily identifiable characters on the program. He also starred in movies like House Guest, Jingle All the Way, and Small Soldiers. He seemed like one of the real good guys, particularly in the world of comedy. Just kind of a normal everyman. Lorne Michaels and the gang on Saturday Night Live referred to him as the glue of the show. He held things together, while never being a star on par with folks like Adam Sandler, Chris Rock, or Chris Farley. Phil Hartman always stood out because of the specificity of his performances and the overall warmth that he brought to every character he portrayed. I would highly recommend the aforementioned biography, You Might Remember Me, if you are interested in delving more into the story of Phil Hartman. And with this being number 2, there's only one more on Living in the Sprawls list of 10 most salacious crimes in the San Fernando Valley. Number 1, I didn't see any other way around it. So even though it's a case that has been covered by a wide array of outlets, it was unavoidable. And number 1, the Wonderland murders. The 4 on the floor murders that took place on Wonderland Avenue on July 1st, 1981. There's a tremendous Wondery narrative series, which is called The Wonderland Murders, that you can listen to for the blow-by-blow account of this incredibly notorious set of murders. But just to lay out the story for listeners a bit, a group of cocaine dealers who called themselves the Wonderland Gang because they lived on Wonderland Avenue in the Laurel Canyon section of the valley, decided they were going to rob nightclub kingpin Eddie Nash at his Studio City home. In order to do this, they enlisted the services of porn star John Holmes, who left the door unlocked as he was friends with Nash and had been at his house. So he leaves the door unlocked. His friends in the Wonderland Gang come by. They ransack the place, rob Nash blind, and get him to beg for his life on his knees. It was a truly horrible crime, which then in turn, once Nash figured out that it was the Wonderland Gang and that John Holmes had been the one who led them to the robbery, instructed Holmes to accompany his bodyguard over to the Wonderland Avenue property to exact revenge on the robbers. What happened inside the home on Wonderland Avenue is the stuff that nightmares are made of. One Los Angeles officer at the time said that the crime scene was actually much worse than the Tate LaBianca murders committed by the Manson family from 1969. 4 people were killed at the house on Wonderland Avenue. 1 managed to survive, although she had permanent injuries as a result of the attack. So this crime was covered not only on the Narrative podcast, but the feature film Wonderland, which is exclusively about this whole situation, starring Val Kilmer, Lisa Kudrow, Eric Bogosian, a number of other faces that you'd recognize. A pretty good movie, but more impressively covered, though not by name, in Paul Thomas Anderson's classic. This is the best movie of the San Fernando Valley, by the way, in your humble correspondent's opinion. Boogie Nights. The Alfred Molina scene where Dirk, John C. Reilly, and Thomas Jane go to rob that home. That's all based on the Wonderland murders set of circumstances. This is one of those crimes that people seem to know about, from Los Angeles to Lisbon and everywhere in between. It kind of defines a certain time, a certain era, and from the perspective of this episode, a certain place in Southern California history. It involves the adult film industry, the drug industry, seediness with a capital S, and it all took place in the backyard behind the Hollywood sign in the San Fernando Valley. That's going to do it for us here. We want to thank you, dear listeners, enormously for all of your continued support and correspondence. Please go ahead and write to us with all of your queries, thoughts, suggestions, anything that you would like to have discussed on the program at livinginthesprawl@gmail.com. Our Instagram handle, Living in the Sprawl Podcast. Please check out our website, Living in the Sprawl Podcast. And we are so excited to have for you guys mugs with our logo embossed on their exterior. We think they look really cool. We believe that you will too. You can go ahead and order your custom Living in the Sprawl mug by sending us a direct message or writing us at the email address that I supplied earlier. Your humble correspondent and host and his lovely and talented producer/fiance both drink out of them every single night. As always, we ask you to write a review and review the show. Give us a 5-star rating if you can. Those seem to have an outsized impact on the way in which a podcast is perceived by Apple and other such outlets. So say nice things. 5 stars, 5 stars. This one has been really fun to research, as they all are. And next week will be no such exception. So on behalf of your humble correspondent and host, that's me. My name is Jon Steinberg, and my lovely and talented producer/fiance, her name is Lisa Lowe. We want to thank everyone, and we say goodbye at Living in the Sprawl, Southern California's most adventurous podcast. Talk to you later.